Hey everyone, and welcome back for another unit builder. With the release of the newest 3 Houses Summer banner, there's been a lot of hype this week in Fire Emblem Heroes. However, lest we forget, we've got a new Tempest Trial event on the horizon, meaning we're finally gonna get the most noble of nobles, the one and only Lorenz Hellman Gloucester. In a speedo! Cause this is exactly the type of male fan service we asked for, right? Making his debut into FEH, Lorenz is coming in as an infantry red tome unit. At 5 stars level 40, his stats read as HP 45, attack 32, speed 31, defense 25, and resistance 29. And friendly reminder, because Lorenz is the free unit, he will not have access to any boons or banes. That being said, Lorenz is another interesting unit we've got on our hands. Much like Sylvain, Lorenz doesn't exactly have the most optimized stats. There's a lot of points going into his HP, some of which could have been better used towards his attack, which is rather low. For me, the worst offender, however, is his speed, as 31 is too low for me to recommend trying to salvage, but also too high to the point that some of that speed could have been better served as attack or resistance. Still, once I actually started coming up with some builds for Lorenz, I found a lot more potential in what he's capable of. That being said, let's move on to his weapon slot, the Conch Bouquet Plus. As an inheritable red tome, this weapon has 12 might and bears the same effect as Sylvain's Baja Blast, as discussed in our previous video. This weapon grants Lorenz attack and resistance plus 5 on the first engagement, each player phase or enemy phase. It also recovers some HP, which is a nice little bonus too. However, unlike with Sylvain, this weapon is a much better fit for Lorenz, as his base resistance is significantly higher. 29 resistance is certainly pliable and we'll definitely be making use of it in both of our builds today. But for anyone who's planning on foddering off this weapon, just remember that the effects only last through one fight in each phase. Meaning that unless that unit is very bulky, they're not going to want to engage in too many rounds of combat per phase. Moving on, Lorenz comes with Pivot as his assist skill, which allows him to pivot to the opposite side of the target ally. It's probably most useful on armor units to help them get around, and well, you all know me, I'm probably going to replace this with reposition anyway. In his A slot, Lorenz comes with Fire Boost 3, which grants him plus 6 attack in combat if his HP is greater than the foe's HP plus 3. It's not the worst skill for Lorenz, seeing as how high his HP is. It's fairly modest, but there are just so many other better A skills that give the same attack boost, if not more, for much easier conditions to meet. And lastly, we've got Even Res Wave 3, which grants plus 6 resistance on even number turns. It also has the added effect of granting that plus 6 resistance to adjacent allies, which is very nice. As I've mentioned before, wave skills are a great budget-friendly option for many units, and month by month, they continue to become more accessible to players, making them a very solid option for anyone tight on resources. Okay, and that wraps things up for his base kit. Let's move on over to our builds and see what we can do with him. On to build number 1. So our first build today is going to be a budget build, allowing any fans of 3 Houses who might be new to Fire Emblem Heroes to be able to build him up fairly quickly. In his weapon slot, you'll notice that we're keeping his Conch Bouquet, but tacking on a Refine in resistance. This build will largely be focusing on maximizing his attack and res in tandem, and so this Refine will grant him an extra 3 points in resistance to help him tank through those magical counterattacks on the player phase. We're gonna jump over to his A skill, which I decided to replace with Mirror Strike, which grants him attack and resistance plus 4 on the player phase. It's a good budget-friendly option if you've got a spare Oliver lying around. However, if you don't have access to Mirror Strike, I might recommend using Death Blow 3 as an alternative. It's much more accessible, and though it doesn't grant him any additional resistance, the plus 6 attack is still very much welcome. Before moving on to our next skill, I do want to point out that Mirror Strike is one of the newest seals to become available from this exact same Tempest Trial, so even if you don't have access to it in his A slot, I would still recommend equipping it as his Sacred Seal. And just to put some numbers into perspective, when we combine the stat boosts from both his Conch Bouquet and both Mirror Strikes, we're looking at a total of plus 13 attack and resistance on the player phase, specifically within the first engagement. This total drops down to plus 8 on any engagements after that, but it's still decently solid. With 32 base resistance plus the 13 from all of our skills combined, that brings his total res up to 45, which is going to make for a very nice iceberg. Iceberg is a special I chose for this build and scales its damage boost off of his res, which is pretty high now. It's got a cooldown cost of 3, which means that he should be activating it fairly frequently, all the while tanking through magical counterattacks in the player phase. Now, in an effort to help him deal more damage, I decided to plug in Res Smoke into his C slot. It inflicts -7 resistance on foes within a 2-tile radius after combat, allowing him to deal even more damage should he be danced back up. If you don't have access to a smoke skill, you're more than welcome to keep even Res Wave as well, as it'll help him out with his Iceberg and has the versatility of applying on both phases. Lastly, this brings me over to our B skill, which is fairly flexible actually. I plugged in Guard as it's still super accessible and still a budget-friendly option for anyone tight on resources. With it, he'll be able to slow the enemy's cooldown charge by 1, making it harder for foes to build up their specials. Alrighty then, and that wraps things up for build number 1. It's a pretty solid budget build, and I hope that any new players out there who are just now jumping into FEH can make use of it. Now, moving on, we're gonna gather some more premium skills and come up with something a bit different for our next build. On to build number 2. So for build number 2, we're aiming to build Lorenz up as an enemy phase ranged tank. With this build, he becomes incredibly bulky and he will be able to tank through a lot of ranged attacks. Starting us off in his weapon slot, I decided to throw in Roar Serpent? I'm sorry if I mispronounced that. This weapon has 12 might and a built-in distant defense effect, meaning that it grants defense and resistance +6 on the enemy phase when attacked by any ranged threats. This includes bows, daggers, tomes, and staff units alike. It's a fairly rare tome that can only be found on Ewan, but it's a great weapon and I think that Lorenz is a fantastic unit to slap it on. Speaking of distant defense, for our A skill, we've got Distant Defense 4, which has the same effect, but grants +8 defense and resistance instead of 6. What can I say? Once I found a niche for a unit, I tend to go all in on those 2 or 3 stats. Now, keep in mind that if you really want to go all the way with this idea, you can also slap Distant Defense 3 as his Sacred Seal, adding another +6 to his overall bulk, bringing that total up to +20. Between all 3 of these skills combined, you're looking at 48 defense and 49 resistance, which is insanely bulky. Now, don't forget that his attack is still pretty low, which is why we're keeping Res Smoke in his C slot to help him deal more damage against oncoming waves of enemies. Now, regardless of which skill you choose for his Sacred Seal, I would definitely still recommend Iceberg as a special on account of his high resistance. And then lastly, this brings us over to our B slot. Since this is an enemy phase build and since we are abandoning his speed, Quick Riposte makes the most sense to guarantee that double in the enemy phase. With all that bulk, he should have no problem maintaining the HP requirement for Quick Riposte. And that is it. That is the end of build number 2. I also considered a player phase build using Hubert's Fox Tome, but I thought this might be a bit more fun and unique for Lorenz. Anyway, here are what his stats look like when fully merged up. It's a shame he doesn't have access to boons, as a boon in attack would really go a long way in helping him deal more damage. Still, I know that some people will really love their golden deer, and so I'm sure players are bound to +10 him anyway. And that is it. That wraps things up for today's video. If you like what you see, please consider liking and subscribing. I post at least 1 new video each week, and I'm going to start live streaming sometime later this month. We've also got a really awesome Discord server that you're more than welcome to join. The invite link is in the description below. Please let me know in the comments section if you plan on building Lorenz up. I'm sure some of you can't resist the power of his speedo. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. My next one will likely be on Resplendent Minerva, our next Resplendent hero for any FEH Pass holders, so stay tuned for that. Until next time, happy saving, happy summoning, and take care.